Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Cosmic I Ching, where we're going through all the 64 hexagrams of the revolutionary book, I Ching Oracle, the Cosmic Way. Here we are on hexagram 33. And this I Ching, it just, if you've read the I Ching before, you need to read this version of the I Ching because it really does give the broadest perspective on all the hexagrams and reveals their true meanings, along with lots of other precious knowledge. So let's continue with hexagram 33 here. Retreat, hiding. And this is heaven over the mountain. The judgment, retreating, success. In what is small, it furthers to be firmly correct. Receiving this hexagram counsels a person to retreat from certain mistaken ideas that keep him tied to the parallel reality created by the collective ego. So we're talking about retreating from certain mistaken ideas. The ideas are based on, and remember, the I Ching, it's like the physics of consciousness. And this is something we haven't really explored in our collective consciousness yet. We don't even recognize our own collective consciousness, our own consciousness. We totally ignore the invisible world of reality, which is outlined in the I Ching. It's the physics of consciousness. The ideas are based on two words that have no cosmic basis: guilt and culprit. Even though they seem small, they have a big effect, if not eliminated by saying the inner no to them. Saying the inner no is the meaning of being firmly correct. A person may receive this hexagram when the ego in him is busy blaming something or someone as guilty or as a culprit, but especially when he is blaming life, the sage, nature, or the way of the cosmos. The sage retreats in the presence of the individual ego with its blaming and demanding. The person is counseled to retreat from his blaming activities through saying the inner no to the ego. Often, rather than face the threat of being condemned by others as guilty, or even to regard himself as guilty, he looks about to find someone or something else to blame. He needs to realize that guilt, in the sense of an inextinguishable stain, does not exist in the cosmic order. It does not exist. Blame, in the cosmic sense, is incurred when a person goes against his true nature by following the rules and values of the collective ego. This blame is erased the moment the person is truly sorry for what he has done and rids himself of the mistaken idea that has led to his error. His regret brings help from the invisible world to heal the damage that has been done. If, however, he believes that what he has done makes him guilty, then he prevents the helpers from healing the situation. He also puts a guilt spell on himself, under which he continues to suffer. The guilt makes him vulnerable to being used or abused by others. It can also make him believe that he must endlessly make atonements or reparations. Retreating can also be counsel to a person to withdraw from fears and doubts that press him to abandon the sage and the helpers he needs to free his true self from its imprisonment. Withdrawal in this case means a determined resistance not to be overcome by fear and doubt, and not to allow his will to be dominated by them. These emotions have their basis in phrases installed in his psyche by the collective ego, to the effect that if he abandons its way, it will punish, abandon, and pursue him to the furthest ends of the earth for retribution. The person can carry out this resistance to the collective ego by firmly saying the inner no to the threatening phrases and to the fears they have inspired in him. Retreating also is the correct interaction to take when a person is tempted to adopt the image of the rugged individualist in defiance of the threats of the collective ego. This rebellious self-image, ironically, is as agreeable to the collective ego as the self-image of the person who goes with the crowd, because in fleeing to yet another self-image, the person remains within its system of self-images. He remains within its system whenever he sees its options in terms of opposites, for it is the collective ego that has defined all possible options in terms of opposites. The ideogram tune, which gives this hexagram its name, in addition to retreating, can have the meaning of the hidden, thus pointing to the invisible world of the helpers. But tune can also refer to the way the collective ego hides the invisible world from view, through presenting itself as the only source of protection and defense, and through presenting the invisible world as unreal. The collective ego similarly hides the true nature of humans behind the pronouncements that humans' animal nature is the source of evil and that they are guilty for having an animal nature. Traditional readings of this hexagram describe a war maneuver, which is a strategic retreat as preparation for an expected attack from an enemy. In its cosmic sense, it describes the reticence of a person in meeting another who has been aggressive and is now approaching to reconnect with them, supposedly in sincerity, but who really is still inwardly aggressive and hoping to catch his opponent off guard. It is correct to maintain reticence and reserve regardless of outer appearances and to wait until the other has become truly sincere. While affairs are in this state, the person can keep track of the inner truth of the situation by checking with the sage. Receiving this hexagram can also indicate that a person needs to retreat from feelings of hurt pride. He does this through turning these feelings over to the cosmos and going into a state of emotional neutrality. Neutrality means, in practical terms, that he takes himself out of first gear, as in wanting to defend himself or in blaming the other, or out of reverse gear, as in wanting to get away and break all contact. He waits instead in neutral, which is devoid of any outward action or violent, unbalanced emotion. In another rendering, this hexagram can be advising a person to retreat from giving up on a situation in which he is misunderstood by another. This retreat has the purpose of allowing time for a true understanding to develop. This hexagram may also help us to recognize and retreat from using techniques in meditation that block the sage from speaking. Among these are meditation techniques that employ mantras, have rigid rules about keeping all thoughts out, control the contents of meditation with the intellect, systematize in any way the communication between the mediator and the sage, or turn meditation into prayer. All these types of meditation or related activities have the effect of keeping the person from freeing himself of hidden elements, such as guilt, thereby maintaining the program of the collective ego in his psyche. When viewed as one of the 12 calendar hexagrams, retreating represents the 8th month, showing the retreat of the light in the course of the year. It is used here as a metaphor for the retreat of the life force from a person. This retreat, if not halted, leads eventually to death. In this aspect of the hexagram, a person is informed that the more he looks outside himself for guidance, instead of to his inner truth and to the sage, the more he comes under the dominance of the collective ego. Because the collective ego defines everything in terms of right and wrong, the person becomes increasingly rigid in his thinking. Ever more separated from his inner truth, he eventually becomes a mere husk of a person who, although outwardly alive, is inwardly dead, operating only on the automatic pilot of his preformed ideas. The hexagram counsels him to retreat from the rigidifying ideas and beliefs that lead to inner death. He also needs to retreat from reliance on pre-structured inner programs that are in conflict with his inner truth and which produce conflict in his outer life. Rigid ideas can never correctly judge the uniqueness of each situation. Line 1, at the tail in retreating. This is dangerous. One must not wish to undertake anything. This line indicates the presence of a guilt spell. One must not wish to undertake anything is the advice given to someone who is about to do something motivated by guilt. When a person is in the process of retreating from following the collective ego in order to follow his inner truth instead, the last means, the tail that the collective ego employs to hold him back, is to make him feel guilty for having separated from its rules and laws. The unwritten musts and shoulds that have been installed in his psyche during childhood and which are combined with the threat of drastic punishments. The danger referred to is that he will give way to his fears of becoming guilty and being punished. He is counseled not to undertake anything out of fear, but instead to ask the sage to help him rid himself both of his fear of guilt and his fear of punishment. If he fails to free himself from these destructive elements before undertaking anything, they will lead to a whole series of tail of complicating factors and create an increasingly toxic and rigid situation. This line also points to the strategy employed by the collective ego to gain access to the individual's life energy. It does so by injecting a guilt/fault spell into his psyche. The first guilt spell reads, "You are born with original fault/sin." The second spell says that evil arises from humans' animal nature, the lower instincts. You see how words can create spells because they affect the invisible, the consciousness of things. Receiving this line indicates that a person needs to ask for help to rid himself of these spells on his true nature. The person may also receive this line when he is in the middle of arguing with another or is tempted to do so to determine who is the guilty party. The message here is retreat from looking for a guilty party or culprit, as no such thing exists in the cosmic order, by saying the inner no to the idea of culprit. He's then counseled to ask the sage in his presence and the sage in the other's presence to intervene with the egos that are active in the situation. This line can also refer to a person's inner arguments, which are a reaction to his feelings of guilt or blame. He may be allowing complaints against the sage or cosmic justice, as when he asks, "Why is this my fate?" It can also refer to inner conflict that is being concealed or repressed rather than addressed. A typical seed phrase in this context is, "This problem needs to be kept in the closet and let sleeping dogs lie." Its premise is that it's easier to control problems by concealing them or by pretending they don't exist, rather than getting to the root causes, which might expose one to shame. Resolving the problems means facing the causes inwardly and eliminating them with the help of the helpers. Line 2, he is held fast with yellow oxhide. No one can tear him loose. This line often refers to a person who, for one reason or another, feels guilty and believes that no one can take his guilt away. These feelings come from mistaken ideas about guilt and blame, from which he needs to free himself. Oxide refers to a particularly strong material that, when used to hold something, holds it fast. Yellow is a metaphor for something that is correct. Yellow oxide, then, is a metaphor for the desire or propensity to be correct. But this desire is being thwarted by something strong. The strong element is the mistaken idea of guilt, which he has accepted from the collective ego. He rightly seeks to free himself of it, but employs means proposed by the collective ego, which, if followed, will give it even more power over him. Because such means are not in harmony with the cosmos, employing them will also create a fate. Such means are placing the blame on somebody else or on one's nature, trying to balance one's guilt by fighting for a cause sanctioned by the collective ego, making atonement through acts of self-sacrifice to compensate for feelings of guilt. For example, a person may be holding on to feelings of guilt for something that has occurred in the past. While he may have incurred true blame, which is always erasable, the ego in him has converted it into guilt, which by definition is not erasable. As long as he believes himself guilty, he may try to make atonement through self-sacrifice. Hence the reference to oxide, since the ox was in ancient times the chief animal of sacrifice. The benefit of this sacrifice of the person's life energy always goes to the collective ego. The remedy is for the person to rid himself of the idea of guilt. Yellow oxide can also refer to a person who, in wanting to do the right thing, has unwittingly adopted the self-image of the good person, the good child, the good father, mother, husband, or wife. And through being taught that being good entails self-sacrifice, turns himself into a slave of his self-image. This image clings to him tenaciously and prevents him from recognizing that behind his desire to be good is his false feeling of inadequacy, due to a spell put on his animal nature by the collective ego. The phrase behind the spell may be, "In and of yourself, you're not good enough," or "Your animal nature is the source of evil." The person needs to recognize that neither a false feeling of inadequacy nor a spell can be compensated for by adopting a better self-image. Both can be removed, however, if he will rid himself first of the spell, then of the self-image. This line can also refer to a person's being held back from learning from the sage because he believes he might be required to give up his position, titles, or other identifications which put him up as special. Entitlements and honors hold him to the collective ego with the strength of oxide, preventing him from retreating from his self-image. Giving up his self-image does not mean that he must give up the position he holds, since whatever the position, the person who has given up his self-image will find himself useful and be aided by the sage. There's literally no downside to giving up the ego, to giving up the self-image. And we know that the self-images and the ego are pretty much one and the same thing. Line 3. Retreating to enslave others is nerve-wracking and dangerous. To retain people as men and maidservants brings good fortune. This line refers to the fate as created when a person has adopted the self-image of the good person, often out of feeling guilty for having an animal nature. Through doing good, he intervenes in the fates of others and thus prevents them from coming to a correct relationship with the cosmos. He also takes over the tasks that rightfully belong to the helpers in order to elevate himself in the eyes of others. Both motives are wrong and embroil him and those he helps in repetitive fates. This is the meaning of nerve-wracking and dangerous. This line shows the function of the guilt spell put upon people by the collective ego, which is to enslave them to its service and garner their life energies through their striving. Yeah. All self-images, regardless of the type, cause a person to strive. This is observable in the person who helps others from the hidden motive of guilt. He actually uses those he helps for his egotistical purpose of being seen as good. In reality, he sucks their energy by making them feel indebted to him, while the collective ego in turn sucks energy from him. The good fortune mentioned that comes from making people into servants, in fact, accrues only to the collective ego. When a person's natural goodness and his cosmic virtues are usurped in the service of the collective ego, it is the cosmic consciousness which is robbed. A self-image, though something we often try to live up to, is more often something we really die to. This selflessness is perhaps the real meaning of Wilhelm's famous metaphor of throwing oneself away. This line can also refer to a person who is incorrectly regarding the sage as a servant of the ego. Doing so would certainly bring misfortune, in that the sage retreats. Line 4, voluntary retreat brings success to the true self and downfall to the ego. Voluntary retreat refers to a person's following his common sense, which tells him there is no advantage in engaging the ego in another person. Through disengaging, he deprives that ego of the energy it had hoped to receive, bringing about its downfall. This line underscores the incessant desire of the ego to attain energy through engaging the egos in others. It succeeds in this effort by employing any number of strategies, ranging from flattery to arousing pity to making the other feel guilty to outright intimidation. The ways by which the individual ego steals energy show that the collective ego can exist only through the agreement among people that the ego games being played are natural. This interaction also shows what happens when one of the two parties retreats from the game ceases. What is not readily observable is the ripple effect that follows when one person withdraws from the collective ego itself by firmly saying the inner no to it. His single action weakens all the games being played by others through strengthening everyone's true self. This line can also refer to times when a person laughs at the downfall of the ego in another, or when he insists that the wrongdoer lose face, or that he must humble himself openly. By such acts, the person engages in feeling superior, something from which he needs to retreat by saying the inner no to the ego in himself. It is never the way of the sage to pour salt into our wounds or to rub our faces in the dirt of our downfall. Line 5, friendly retreat. To be firmly correct brings success. This line refers to keeping an outer composure in the face of someone's incorrect behavior, while at the same time firmly saying the inner no. This gives an inner message to the other's true self that it needs to distance itself from the ego and that it can do so without a loss of face. In this way, one is friendly with the other's true self while being firmly correct with the ego. Line 6, cheerful retreat. Everything serves to further. This line refers to the sage that, in retreating from the ego in a person, never does so in anger or vindictiveness or to punish him. It retreats cheerfully, knowing how that person will ultimately feel relief when he turns away from the ego and himself to reunite with the sage. The sage's retreat to support the person's true self is the meaning of everything serves to further. Receiving this line may be telling a person that he must not, for any reason, throw his energy away in an effort to please another or in the help to gain nourishment from that person's recognition. Doing so causes the sage, which connects him with this true source of nourishment, to retreat. When a person is indulging in self-blame, the harassing voices of the ego, the fact that the sage has retreated can finally call him back to listen to his common sense. To free himself, he needs to say the inner no to blaming himself. This line can also refer to a person who believes that he needs to retreat from society in order to follow the way of the sage. This belief is a misunderstanding of retreat, since all retreat refers to inwardly distancing oneself from the ego, either in oneself or the collective ego. Making outer retreat means that he carries the ego into a grudging solitude, since he then sees himself as better than those he left behind. He also remains attached to the collective ego by setting himself up in opposition to it. That's what's happening on the invisible plane. Outwardly retreating from a group is justifiable, however, when the group is about to create a fate. And yeah, I would say all the people wanting everyone to get vaccines right now is something that people need to retreat from. You need to retreat from that group ego behavior of wanting forced mandatory vaccines on people. Or I think you might be involved in some kind of group fate that is absolutely going to come out of all that. I just had to put that in there. But that's all for this time, guys. See you in the next one.